set me aback, and I was surprised. Can you switch me over back there, Logan? Hopefully we're going to get it. There we go. Someone here recently asked me this question: are we guilty of moral superiority? And as I said, I was sort of taken aback by the question. I got to tell you, initially it actually hurt my feelings that someone would suggest that that might be the case. But I promised to consider it and to bring a lesson. And so I want to do that tonight. Our study tonight is I think, a worthy question concerning us and our relationship with other people and the way we interact with other people. Are we guilty of moral superiority? Before we get into that, I want to stop and thank you all for being here this evening. We appreciate you very much. We've got visitors tonight. We're always grateful for our visitors, and we want you to come back every time you have a chance to be here. If you have any questions or if we can be of help to you in any way, please let us know. You know, actually, this is a challenge that we face fairly often. It's worded a little different here, but how often have you had an occasion where someone knows that you're a member of the Church of Christ and they say to you, you Church of Christ people, you think that you're better than everybody else? Or you Church of Christ people, you think you're the only ones going to heaven? Now, I think we almost immediately respond to those kinds of things by saying, no, we don't think we're better. We're not claiming that we're sinless or perfect or better. And we really think that the only ones going to heaven are the ones that God describes in His Word, those who do what God teaches in His Scripture. And so we are not claiming moral superiority. But it is something that we are sometimes accused of, and we want to think about it for a few minutes this evening. Now, my first observation, this is where I'd like to start, is that acting as though you're better than others, morally superior to other people, that is actually a real and dangerous possibility. It can happen. It's certainly possible, and we have to be on guard about that. In the Bible, the Pharisees are a classic example of this. The Pharisees certainly were people who acted in a morally superior way. In the text that was read to you just a few minutes ago from Luke chapter 18, notice, Wade read this for us from Luke 18, beginning verse 9. He told a parable, but he told the parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they treated others with contempt. So here's why the parable was taught. Two men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee. Okay, so he's especially addressing this attitude of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were people who thought they were righteous, and they treated others with contempt. And so two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat on his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Notice, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So this Pharisee, this parable really paints a clear picture, doesn't it, of what the Pharisees were like. It's hard to miss it. The parables are that way. Jesus was a master teacher. When he taught in parables, you can just see it, right? And you can see that in this parable about the Pharisee and the publican. This is really hard to miss. The Pharisee made no requests of God. He's praying to God, but he doesn't even ask God for anything. Basically, he spends his time just bragging on himself, and that bragging itself is quite despicable. But the conclusion was that he was not justified. The humble publican was justified. And so here we see what the Lord's impression is of someone like a Pharisee who treats others with contempt, who imagines that he's better than others. We've got to be aware of that. It is a clear danger, and the Pharisees certainly were guilty of it. In a separate famous text in Matthew chapter 23, beginning at verse 2, Jesus said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen of others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. When you read this, I think that you can clearly see that the Pharisees were just eaten up with pride. And that pride is what led them to act morally superior to others. And so our first observation is an important one. This is a danger. You can be that way. People have been that way. The Pharisees are a classic example, and they stand as a real warning to us. But actually, there are plenty of other warnings in the New Testament for us not to think too highly of ourselves. In Romans chapter 12, verse 3, Paul says, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Don't think more highly of yourself than you should. A very important warning for us. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 3, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And so, I think as we're studying this question, it's a really important question. Are we guilty of acting like we're morally superior to other people? The first thing that I think we want to stress is that certainly can happen. It's a dangerous possibility. People certainly have been guilty of it. The Pharisees are the best example in the New Testament, but all of us have this danger, and we've got to be on guard about it. Okay, having laid that groundwork, now let's make this point. There are some things that people might accuse us of acting morally superior, but they actually do not constitute moral superiority. For instance, when we point out doctrinal error, when we say that somebody is guilty of doing something that's not sound, that is not true to the Word of God, when they're erring in doctrinal matters, that is not wrong, and that is not moral superiority. Paul, when he was writing to the young evangelist Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, verse 19, he pointed out false teachers. And I want you to notice that he even named names. Paul said in 1 Timothy 1, verse 19, holding faith and a good conscience, with some having put away concerning faith, have made shipwreck, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, who I have delivered unto Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. And so he was warning Timothy, and he specifically named individuals who were guilty of this false teaching. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 at verse 16, he says, shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus. This Hymenaeus must have been a particularly bad false teacher. He's named in both 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. But again, Paul's not adverse to saying, those are the guys that I'm talking about. And that's their names. Beware of those guys, because they're not sound in the faith. The Apostle John warned bluntly in 2 John verses 7 through 11. 2 John, of course, just one chapter. In verses 7 through 11, for many deceivers are entered into the world. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. If there come any unto you and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed, for he that biddeth him Godspeed is partaker of his evil deeds. Notice this was about doctrine. And the issue was these people were not teaching sound doctrine. And false teachers, they're plenty deceivers, he says, who've gone out in the world. Be careful. Don't participate with them. Don't encourage them. Don't participate in their evil deeds. And so it is not acting in a morally superior way when we point out that someone is guilty of teaching or practicing doctrinal error. The apostles did that. Paul did that. John did that. And so when we do that, we're just imitating the inspired apostles. That is not wrong. I would further suggest to you that it's not wrong, and we're not acting like we're better than anybody else when we condemn immoral conduct. And so it's not just doctrinal error that must be exposed. immorality also has to be exposed. John the Baptist serves as a great example of someone who spoke out against a person who was engaged in immorality. In this case, the one he spoke out against was King Herod. In Mark 6, verse 17, beginning, Herod had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. That's pretty blunt, isn't it? It's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. But something that I think is interesting to note, notice the verb here. John had been saying. And so you get the idea that this was a repeated theme that John had hit upon. He didn't just once say to Herod, Herod, you shouldn't be married to her. You don't have a right to be married to her. He had been repeating that. And I tell you, pretty dangerous to be repeating that to a man in the position of King Herod. And we know what ultimately happened here. John was beheaded. He lost his head because he had been condemning this sort of immorality. And so, again, it's not wrong to do so when we have biblical examples of those men of God who did it. You know well how the Corinthian church was condemned because they didn't speak out against a gross case of immorality in their own ranks. In 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, it is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and such immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. You have become arrogant, have not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. So here the church at Corinth was actually rebuked because they had not been pointing out and speaking out against this immoral situation. And so condemning immoral conduct, that does not put us in the situation of acting in a morally superior way. That sort of immoral conduct still happens. We still need to speak out against it. And then I would also add that when we rebuke unfaithfulness, this is appropriate. So doctrinal areas, immoral conduct, yes, but even when someone's just being unfaithful, not living the way a Christian should live, that is something that has to be pointed out and specified. We have the familiar case in Galatians 2 of Peter. Here his name Cephas is used. But when Cephas or Peter came to Antioch, Paul says, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came and he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all. Notice, Paul says, I opposed him to his face. I said to Cephas before them all, and then the text goes on how he rebuked Peter in this situation. And so here, again, Paul sets an example, and he actually tells us there's not anybody immune from being rebuked when they're wrong. And it is necessary and important for us to do that. And so I think this is a really important consideration for us. These things that we've just been talking about, you're not trying to act better than someone when you do this. You're actually following the example of the inspired apostles when you do this sort of thing. Pointing out doctrinal error, condemning immoral conduct, and rebuking unfaithfulness. Now, having said that, let's ask this question. Why are these things necessary? Why is it important that we do this? Now, I hope you get the point that I'm making here. I don't even think this is optional for us. This is not the kind of thing where, well, if you choose to do it, okay. If you choose to do it, you wouldn't be doing wrong. It's not like that. This is something that we're actually instructed to do. We must do these things. And there's some reasons why that I think we would want to dwell upon. First of all, and we could just stop our considerations right here. We do it because God commands us to do this. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. A couple of words here to concentrate on, reprove and rebuke. Those are words that suggest the necessity of correcting someone when they're wrong. You reprove them. A stronger word, you rebuke them. And so this is telling us that we've got to address situations where wrong is taking place. So there are two negatives, and the second one's stronger than the first one, but we must act in this way because this is actually a command that we must follow. In Titus chapter 1, the Apostle Paul was describing the qualifications of elders. Remember, he had assigned Titus the duty to appoint elders in some of the churches where he was working. And in Titus 1 is an important text for us as we consider the qualifications of elders right here at College View. But read with me some. We won't go into detail about all of this. I think Josh and I will be doing that in the future if we get to that point. But in Titus chapter 1, verse 7, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-control. Notice, here's the part I want you to really concentrate on. Holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching. Why? So that he will be able both to exhort in the sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. And so here's the qualifications for someone who might serve as elder. He's got to be a knowledgeable man because one of the things that he's expected to do is to refute those who are teaching error. He goes on, he says, for there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things that they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. And so, again, this is in particular context of qualifications of elders. But the qualification of an elder is he got to know the word well so he can refute those who are teaching error, so he can silence those who are deceiving people with their false teaching. Obviously, it's important for us to be able to do that. It is commanded. God expects us to do that. Galatians 6, verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye with your spirits will restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So here's a man, he's overtaken in a fault. What am I going to do about that? Well, I don't want him to think that I don't want him to think that I think that I'm better than he is. I certainly wouldn't want him to imagine that I think I'm somehow morally superior to him. And so I'm just not going to say anything. Well, that would be absolutely directly disobeying this instruction, wouldn't it? So the man's overtaken. What do? I go to him. I make efforts to restore him. And that is not wrong. It is actually right and commanded. And so the kind of actions that we're describing tonight are important and necessary, first of all, because God commands them. And secondly, because souls are at stake. I think this is a point that perhaps too often is ignored by those who are critical of the kind of things that we're describing tonight. You know, there are a lot of people who are just not comfortable with doing what we're suggesting is necessary. When we point out error and immorality and unfaithfulness, there's just a lot of people who are not comfortable with that. I think that they are overlooking the fact that what motivates us to do this, or at least what should motivate us to do this, is that we love the souls of men. In every case, I really believe it's true that it would be easier to look the other way. Here's a guy who's doing something he shouldn't do. Here's a guy who's teaching something that's in error. Here's a guy living in immorality. Here's a Christian that's not being faithful to the Lord. I'm going to tell you, in every case, it would just be easier to look the other way. I don't want to deal with that. You know, it's unpleasant. I get all nervous when I have to talk to someone about something like that, and I don't like that nervous feeling I get when I have to talk to somebody like that. So I'm going to tell you, I'm just not going to do it. Well, when I make that decision, do you realize a couple things? We already said I'm denying a direct command of God, and I am not showing appropriate love for that person who's engaged in this wrong activity. And so love for souls should motivate us. Again, I don't think sometimes that the people who are critical of these kinds of steps really understand that that's what's motivating us to do it. Certainly be easier to look the other way, but with love and concern for a lost soul, we have to act. Here's a clear picture of what this is all about. You remember the statement to the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. I think this really pictures this idea of speaking up because people are in danger. Ezekiel 3, beginning verse 17. Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. So Ezekiel was saying, if you don't give the warning, then I'm going to hold you accountable. Now, if you give the warning and he doesn't pay attention to your warning, then he's responsible for himself. But if a dangerous situation exists and you don't speak up to address it, you're the watchman and you're supposed to give a warning. And if you don't give the warning, I'm going to hold you accountable, right? Well, that again, I think it really well describes the kind of situation we're talking about here. We got people in danger. They're in danger because of false doctrine or immorality or unfaithfulness. If we don't speak up, then God's going to hold us accountable in such a matter as that. Actually, we're doing a great favor to those that we help in this way. We're not being morally superior. We're not acting like we're better than they are. We're actually doing them a great favor to save their soul from eternal loss. James 5, verse 19, my brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. And so, again, it's important. It's the best thing we could do for somebody who's in that kind of situation, to save a soul from death. All right, so know that we need to do these things for a couple of simple reasons. God commands them, and souls are at stake. We got to work at maintaining a strict balance. I believe it's necessary for us to work hard to be both humble and bold. You know, what we've been suggesting requires a measure of boldness. To be able to speak up. Again, it'd be easier to ignore it. It'd be easier to look the other way. You got to have a sense of boldness and courage. You're going to be willing to address this. Very often, the people that you have to address, at least initially, might not appreciate what you're doing. That happens a lot of times. And many times people reject your efforts to try and correct them in what they're doing. And so you got to have a sense of boldness and courage. But I'd like to suggest to you that it also requires us to have a humble spirit about us. I want to take you back to one of those texts wherein Paul named the names of certain false teachers. In 1 Timothy 1, verse 19, where we read just a few moments ago, Paul said to Timothy, holding faith in a good conscience, which some having put away concerning faith have made shipwreck, of whom is Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I delivered unto Satan, that they might learn not to blaspheme. So he's calling them out. He's calling out these false teachers. He's naming them by name. But I want you to notice that in the immediate context of this, back up at verse 15, he said, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. And so Paul certainly humbly acknowledges his own failures here. I'm the chief of sinners. But that did not keep him from addressing and by name, naming these men who were engaged in error. So Paul had that balance, I think, that we need to be striving for. Bold, he didn't hesitate to call them out, but in the very same context, to humbly acknowledge that he was a chief of sinners, he said there in verse 15. So, with that in mind, then I think we've got to constantly be checking our hearts in this matter. We should be analyzing constantly what is it that's motivating us to do this. So I'm going to go to somebody and I'm going to tell them where they're wrong in some of the ways that we've been describing tonight. Why am I going to do that? I need to make sure that I'm motivated in the proper way. Am I doing this because I really want to help that person? Or Am I doing this to exalt myself? Gotcha. Proved you wrong. Which of those is? Now, it's the same action. I'm going to go to this guy, and I'm going to point out his error. Am I pointing out, what's motivating me? Am I motivated because I really want to help that guy, and I want him to take measures to save his soul? Or am I doing it because I just want to prove I'm smarter and better than he is? What's my motivation? Am I seeking to teach and restore this person? Or am I just looking for recognition in the process? Again, it's the same action, but it can be done with different motives. And I want to suggest to you that we need to be constantly checking our heart. We've got to do this work. Make sure you're being motivated in the work for the right reasons. And then there's an expression that I think we probably need to print it off and stick it on the refrigerator. We've got to be speaking the truth in love. We've been studying recently in Ephesians, even chapter 4. We're still in chapter 4 in our Sunday morning class. But there's a phrase that the Apostle Paul uses that I think is so important. He says, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about with every wind of doctrine. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way and to him that is the head, even Christ. A real important phrase there, speaking the truth in love. We got to speak the truth, but what's motivating us to speak the truth? Speaking the truth in love. And so that is certainly necessary. Bottom line is that we've got to stand firm without becoming pharisaical. We described the Pharisees at the start of the lesson. They were always correcting people about this or that or another. But the problem was that they were doing it for the wrong purposes. We want to stand firm for God's truth, but we don't want to imitate the example of the Pharisees. But when we point out, as we said in our lesson, when we point out error, a doctrinal error, when we condemn immoral conduct, when we rebuke unfaithfulness, this is not acting in a morally superior way. The world, and I think you know this, and even sadly I think some of our own brethren try to silence the truth by assigning ugly labels to us. And they might say, oh, you're just being judgmental, or you're acting in a holier than thou sort of way. You're just being self-righteous, they say. You're acting morally superior. Now, they may say that, but I want to tell you, it was not true. Those labels, it wasn't true when Paul condemned Peter. It wasn't true when John the Baptist condemned King Herod. And it's not true of us either if we act with pure motives. We need to be humble but firm. We need to love the souls of men and uphold truth. And we need to avoid pride. And we need to imitate Paul's example. It is what we're supposed to do. It is actually what God expects us to do. So I hope the lesson is helpful. I think this is an important question, a worthy one to consider. Are we guilty of moral superiority? Well, it's certainly possible, and it should never happen. And to whatever extent it does happen, we need to correct that, right? It's a possibility. But know that a lot of people in the world, and sadly even some of our own brethren, will say we're guilty of that when we're not, when we're just simply doing what we're instructed and commanded to do. Hope that lesson is helpful, and I hope it addresses that question in an appropriate way. I do think it's a worthy thing for us to consider. Thanks for listening. We hope it's helpful. We're going to sing a song of invitation. As we sing this song of invitation, we'll be asking everybody here, is your life right with God? Have you obeyed that simple gospel plan of salvation? Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. If not, we hope you make that decision and all that goes with it. If you're a Christian already, but you've not been living faithfully, come back in repentance, confession, and prayer. If we can help in any way, let us know while we stand and sing this song.